There is a popular urban myth concerning an old Chinese curse that says, "May you live in interesting times." And though the saying is more likely a modern Western invention, there is a certain irony to it. The idea is better to live in boring, uneventful times in relative safety and stability than times that are marked by intrigue and turmoil. Those of us old enough to remember or have studied history will know that during the 20th century, the world saw some very interesting times indeed. Revolutions, 2 world wars, famine, an influenza pandemic, the atom bomb used on 2 cities, killing mostly civilians, invasions, the rise of militant ideologies, religious wars, ideological wars, the rise of deadly ideologies like fascism, Nazism, communism, totalitarianism, and mass murder on a scale never before seen in the history of mankind. We've seen examples of mass psychosis, mass hysteria, mass consumption, and propaganda used to alter the human psyche, not seen since the religious conversions of the 4th, 7th and 16th centuries. If we look back just 100 years and take a snapshot of the world, we see a time of great hardship in the Western world. The First World War had ended, was followed by the great flu pandemic that killed up to 100 million people. That's between 4 and 5 times the number of deaths in World War I for both combatants and civilians. For the past 75 years or so, the world, or at least the Western world, has seen a period of relative peace. Since 1945 and the second atom bomb dropped on Nagasaki, there has been various conflicts, notably in the Middle East, over oil and territory, and much of that is leftover conflict from the World Wars Parts 1 and 2, and the carving up of the regions by the Allied powers in the wake of both wars. The other conflicts have been ideological ones. Western attempts at curbing the rise of communism, and both sets of conflicts are still playing themselves out in the Middle East and in Eastern Asia. In this series of discussions, I will attempt to make some sense of what has brought us to this set of circumstances we now find ourselves in. In Australia, we've had a long period of stability indeed. Aside from largely token efforts in global peacekeeping, which is not at all to in any way diminish or fail to recognise our gallant military personnel for their sacrifices. But aside from sending troops and support personnel to various theatres of war on a small scale, we've not seen any real threat to our security since 1945. 3 generations of Aussies have never experienced any existential threat worse than the odd gunman or crazed driver bent on 15 minutes of ideologically driven mayhem, and perhaps far worse, the erosion of the social structure of the family and the loss of the cohesive nature of what Australian society once looked like. The threat we now face is one driven by ideology, and it is this we will examine in how it has and will manifest, how it came about, its context in the realm of both public and private life, and what we can and must do to counter it. Since the advent of the current pandemic, just short of 2 years at the time of writing, the stability and sleepy unawareness of anything remotely dramatic has been replaced by a feeling of marked uncertainty. First we saw state borders close and lockdowns, governments citing case statistics, positive tests, hospitalisations and deaths. Retail businesses in the major population centres closed, some never to open again. Offices, entertainment venues, whole business sectors either adapted, offering work from home options to workers, or simply ceased operations altogether. State governments took to enforcement, declaring a state of emergency, and federal government doled out huge injections of welfare in various programs to keep the economy from spiralling downward into catastrophic depression. The feds kept this up until the levels of debt became higher than they were prepared to put the nation into. Within a year, as soon as the initial outbreak was under control, additional welfare was more or less cut off, and as most of the country went back to work, it seemed that once again Australia was saved by isolation and a robust economy. The horror stories coming from Europe in mainstream media certainly gave us a sense of comparative safety and distance. But those stories, plus what was coming out of China in underground and alternative media, were terrifying. Out of all the confusion and the mixed messages from the onset, from the conflicting stories of bat soup to Wuhan wet market, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to rushed development of vaccines and the sinister undertones of mandatory vaccinations, vaccine passports, check-ins and monitoring, the suspension of basic civil liberties such as freedom of movement and freedom of speech. The one continuous characteristic there has been in a conflicting dual narrative that has ensured no one, unless they are disposed to accepting the official narrative, has any real grounding in solid, reliable information. The entire episode has been marked by confusion, uncertainty, and an authoritarian approach by government and the media. Little wonder that so many are distrustful of government and see the mainstream media as liars and rank propagandists. You have been listening to Australian Perspectives, and that brings us up to pretty much when things went pear-shaped in Ukraine. Please like and subscribe, and thank you for listening.